In this video, we're going to walk through how to set up security on individual PIPOINTs. And PIPOINTs are also sometimes called PI tags, same thing. And keep in mind that security can be set up on each PIPOINT because it really allows you to control, well, which users can see different types of data in the Pi system, or even which applications can read data from or write data to specific PIPOINTs. We'll accomplish this by assigning permissions for our Pi identities on our PIPOINTs. Remember, Pi identities can be used in Pi Data Archive versions 3.4, 3.80, 36, and later. Let's start off by opening up Pi System Management Tools. It's important to remember that to configure PIPOINT security, I may need to adjust the permissions on the PIPOINT database security table, and I definitely will need to make changes on point security and data security on the individual PIPOINTs I'm configuring. What this means is that I need read-write access to all these areas to be able to successfully make these changes. Let me start off by looking at an existing PIPOINT. So I'm going to go to the Points plugin and then select Point Builder down here. And I'll use the search here. And let me just move this over. Okay, so I'm going to do a search for a point called sinusoid. Now, sinusoid is a default PIPOINT, so it's good to be used for testing since it's not going to impact any of our production PIPOINTs. And because it's a default PIPOINT, it should be available on most systems. So I'll go ahead and search for it. Okay, great. So sinusoid is returned here, and I can see some of the settings like the descriptor. I can see this PIPOINT and its settings because the way I authenticate has certain permissions. Let me write those permissions out real quick. So I can see sinusoid because the way that I authenticate has read on PIPOINT as well as read specifically on sinusoid for point security. If I didn't have these permissions when we search for sinusoid, I wouldn't receive an error, but basically nothing would show up here. I also want to point out that when I hovered over the result, I get the value and the timestamp for sinusoid. I can see data for sinusoid again because I have permissions to do so. Okay, so I can see the data again because the way I authenticate has PIPOINT read, point security read for sinusoid, as well as data security read on sinusoid. And the way that I just searched for the PIPOINT and saw data for it in Pi System Management Tools, I'm going to have that same behavior, not just in Pi System Management Tools, but in any client tool or application that I use, if I'm searching for PIPOINTs or looking at data for PIPOINTs. So now let's check the settings, and I'll prove to you that I have the permissions that I just listed. I'll hit OK. And the first thing that I said is I must have read on the PIPOINT database security table. Let's check that by going security to database security here. And okay, PIPOINT is here. Now to check the way that I authenticate, I should look down here at the bottom. And this shows me all the identities or users and groups that I receive. And just one of these needs to have the permission to do the task for me to be able to do it. So I've received Pi admins in all company, and in fact, both of these have read, but I just needed one to have read on PIPOINT. Okay, And let's also take a look back on Point Builder. So sinusoid, let's look at the specific security settings for sinusoid. Okay, so I can see that I have point security here on the left, data security on the right, and these are the identities that currently have permissions on sinusoid. So again, the way I authenticate looks like only PyAdmins is currently configured. So let me check those settings. And just like I knew I had to have, for point security, I have read, and for data security, I have read. You'll also notice that as PyAdmins, because I'm the Pi system administrator, I also have write to sinusoid for both point security and data security. So what does this give me? Well, let's start off here with point security. Because I have write on point security, I'm going to be able to change the settings for the sinusoid PiPoint. So I can make modifications on any of these tabs. And on the security tab, I'll be able to also change the settings on point security. I won't be able to change data security because data security actually requires write on data security. But let's focus on point security again. And let's say on the general tab, I want to edit the descriptor for sinusoid. Because this is a default PiPoint, maybe I want to make sure that my users know that, hey, if they're trying to do just some testing for some settings or permission, sinusoid could be a good point to use. So I'm going to hit save, and you'll see down at the bottom that I was able to successfully edit this point, and that's because I have write on point security for sinusoid. Having write on point security for sinusoid would also allow me to modify who else gets to have read or write on point security. If I hit add, I can add new identities, and when I hit save, the point will also be successfully edited. If I didn't have write permissions, I would receive an error when I go to save the changes. Now let's talk about data security. Having write on data security is going to give me the ability to modify the data for the sinusoid PiPoint. Let me show you how an example of this by going to Data and Archive Editor. And here I'll look at the historical and current value for sinusoid. Okay, and because of the fact that I have write on data security, I'll be able to edit or delete or even write new values. So for example, let me change this value. And keep in mind, I'm doing this on sinusoid as an example because sinusoid is a test PiPoint, right? I wouldn't want to change the data for my production PiPoints unless there was a reason for me to do so. And I was able to successfully save this here. Keep in mind that data security is going to give access to modified data from any application. So not just here in Archive Editor and Pi System Management Tools, but from any application. And this is typically used because our Pi interfaces and buffering are going to be responsible for, say, writing the data to PiPoints. So this setting will be important for them. Let's jump back to Point Builder. So keep in mind that having write on data security is going to be required to be able to make any changes to data security. Just to recap, so if somebody needs to be able to see data for a particular PiPoint, they're going to need read on point security and data security for that PiPoint. If they need to be able to change the settings for the PiPoint, they'll need to have write on point security. And if they're trying to change the data security setting itself, they're going to need to have right on data security. A good reference for these different permissions that I just covered is a table in the PyLib library. So in the PyLib library, there's this task-based access permissions reference table, which can be found in our PyServer user guide. And there's a specific list here of all the different tasks that you might be doing with PyPoints and their database security permissions, as well as if other permissions are needed, like on point security or data security. For example, this helps us remember to be able to see data, we'll need PIPOINT read, as well as point security and data security read. And in fact, to do any action with a PIPOINT, even just seeing the data, you'll notice that PIPOINT read will always be required. Now that we understand how the permissions work, let's configure the security for a particular PIPOINT that I want to set up. I'm going to jump back to PySystem Management Tools, and I'm going to search for one of our production PIPOINTs. Okay, and I'm going to do this for the pump 5 status. So I'll select pump 5, make sure that I am looking at the pump 5 status PIPOINT. In the previous video, I created new identities for all company employees and consultants in PyCoreSite and gave them read on the PIPOINT database security table. But I haven't configured the permissions on the individual PIPOINTs. And so right now, these cannot see the PIPOINTs that they need to. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and switch to the security tab. Because the way I authenticate has right on point security, I'm going to be able to change this. So I want to add all company consultants in PyCoreSite and make sure that they have read. You can see that I successfully edited it, and then I'll go ahead and make the change on data security. And I'll go ahead and save that. Again, I could do this because I had right on data security. So now, any user that receives the consultants or all company identity should be able to see the pump 5 status PIPOINT that I just set up the security for. And let's do a test for that. So I'm going to run PySystem Management Tools by Shift right click, run as a different user. And we have a user named Isaac who's part of our all company domain group. And so he's going to receive the all company identity. So let's do a test with him. So his Windows account, to make things easy on us, is iUser. And let's have him do a search for PIPOINTs. Because I know only one result is going to be returned, I'll just go ahead and hit search without specifying the name to search for. And yep, okay, I can see now that Isaac is able to find the pump 5 status PIPOINT, and that Isaac indeed received the all company identity. So we've verified that our users that receive the all company identity are going to be able to see this PIPOINT. Let's do the same thing really quickly for our consultants. We also have Sarah, and Sarah is a consultant, and her Windows account is just sconsultant. And again, we can see that Sarah can also find the pump 5 status PIPOINT. So I was able to configure the security for this PIPOINT, but I have many other PIPOINTs that already exist that I need to configure the security for as well with the exact same settings. So trying to do this in Point Builder is going to be slow, but I can use PyBuilder, which is an Excel add-in that is going to allow me to really quickly modify PIPOINTs. So I'm going to switch over to Excel and use PyBuilder. If you haven't seen PyBuilder before, we have a lot of great videos on how to use PyBuilder on our YouTube channel. And what I'm going to be doing with PyBuilder is I'm going to be changing the data security and the point security for my PIPOINTs. You can see that how I have this set up is I'm going to give the consultants access to just the Pump 5 PIPOINTs that we're interested in sharing with them. And on the other hand, all company, which is all of our employees, is going to get access to every PIPOINT. So you can see that here. One thing that you might also notice is that I have given PyCoursight read access to all of the PIPOINTs as well. I can safely do this because in this environment, I have configured Kerberos delegation for PyCoursight. This means that if somebody is using PyCoursight, they will only be able to see the PIPOINTs that they have permissions to. Everything looks good here, so I'm going to go ahead and publish these changes. As you can see, PyBuilder allows me to really quickly change the settings for a large number of PIPOINTs, and I can confirm that this worked if I switch back. For example, let's have Isaac search for PIPOINTs again. Okay, and we can see that Isaac is now able to see all the PIPOINTs that the all company identity just recently received permissions to. And let's also test with our consultant, Sarah. So again, Sarah here, and the search, we see that our consultant's identity has been successfully added for all of our Pump 5 PIPOINTs. Okay, perfect. So at this point, I've configured the security on all of my PIPOINTs. But what about new PIPOINTs that get created? How will their security be configured? Well, let me create a new PIPOINT as a test. So let's switch back to my Pi System Management Tools setting as the Pi System Administrator. I'm going to go and do new PIPOINT. And I'm going to be able to successfully create new PIPOINTs because I have write access on the PIPOINT database security table. I'm going to create a PIPOINT called test and hit save. We can see that I successfully created it. And let's go over to the security tab and see what defaults are used for point security and data security. So we can see that these are the identities that got added on point security and data security by default. When a new PIPOINT is created, it inherits the permissions that are currently set on the database PIPOINT security table. So let's switch to database security. Okay, yep, so we can see that it took the permissions that were currently on the PIPOINT and it assigned these same permissions, read and write, on both the point security and data security. These defaults, however, aren't necessarily what we want. Keep in mind that consultants is on here, but we don't necessarily want consultants to see all the new PIPOINTs that get created. And I know that the consultants can see it. Let's switch back to Sarah and confirm that, yep, when Sarah does the search, she can now see the test PIPOINT. So when I'm setting up new PIPOINTs, I want to make sure that I modify the defaults for what makes sense for that individual PIPOINT. So in this case, I'm going to remove consultants and save. To conclude, remember that for any user or application that needs to see even just one PIPOINT, they need read on the PIPOINT database security table. And on given PIPOINTs, we can customize point security and data security to give our users and applications exactly the access that they need.